Andrey always considered himself a pragmatic person. At 32, he had already achieved what most of his friends considered success: career advancement at a major IT company, an apartment in a new part of the city, a neat car, and a quiet life without unnecessary surprises. At first glance, he lived by the rules, discipline, planning, and cold calculation. But behind this facade lurked a habit of gaining advantage by any means necessary. Andrey was someone who never passed up a chance to undermine a colleague if it meant getting a promotion. He easily exploited people's weaknesses. Some trusted him, some were too soft, and some simply didn't suspect that the person working alongside them was a tool, not a law. He didn't consider the consequences of his actions. Life is too short to be honest with everyone, he told himself. And it was true. His decisions brought immediate results: a promotion, a bonus, recognition from his superiors. People admired him, unaware of the cold, calculating nature hidden behind that facade. One morning, as usual, he arrived at the office with a cup of coffee and, sitting down at his computer, noticed a message in the company chat from a colleague, Irina. She had recently joined the team and hadn't yet figured out how things worked. The message was innocent: a request for help with a short report that was due later that day. Andrey, without thinking, replied curtly, "I'm busy right now. You'll figure it out yourself." He didn't even look up from his monitor as Irina felt a slight sense of confusion. She tried to be tactful and not take offense, but something inside her was tugging at her heartstrings. Later, in a conversation with other colleagues, she gently hinted that Andrey often acted coldly and calculatingly. None of the older co-workers were surprised. That's how he worked. The day passed in its usual rhythm: meetings, calls, reports. But by evening, Andrey felt a slight irritation. His boss had suddenly asked him to stay late to discuss the strategy for a new project. Andrey tried not to show his fatigue, though his thoughts were racing with how he could use this situation to his advantage. He noticed that his colleague, who usually claimed the top spot, seemed less prepared, and an idea flashed through his mind: if I can arrange things so I get the credit, that would be great. And so he did. He exploited his colleague's weaknesses, gently hinted to his boss that he could handle the task better himself, and the project was assigned to him. He felt a sense of satisfaction. Once again, he had managed to outsmart everyone with cunning and calculation. But life, as often happens, likes to give signals. The next day, Andrey received a strange message on his personal phone. Not from friends, not from colleagues, but from someone he hadn't seen in a while. An old acquaintance from university, Sergey. "Hi, Andrey. It's been a while. I want to meet up and talk about the past." Andrey waved him off. "So what? It's just the past," flashed through his mind. But something compelled him to agree. Perhaps it was the habit of being in control. If you meet someone, you can figure out what they want and use it to your advantage. At the cafe where they met, Sergey looked different than before. He was calm, almost peaceful, and Andrey, initially irritated by the time-wasting meeting, gradually began to listen. Sergey told him about his life, how he helped people, how he strived to be honest and open. He spoke of moments when his actions came back to him in the form of good fortune or trouble, depending on how he treated others. Andrey listened skeptically. "It's all philosophy. Life doesn't work that way," he thought. But deep down, something began to waver. It wasn't a realization, more like a small doubt that quickly tried to get lost among other thoughts about work and personal gain. After the meeting, he returned home, but the feeling of discomfort persisted. That evening, he noticed several minor annoyances happening in quick succession. He forgot his keys, was late for an important call, his computer unexpectedly froze. These were all trivial, but his irritation grew. He began to resent other people and circumstances, not realizing that these were only the first signs of how small actions could have consequences. A week later, something more serious happened at work. The colleague he'd recently set up did something Andrey hadn't expected. He carefully exposed all of his machinations on the project. At a meeting, his boss glanced at the documents, noticed discrepancies, and immediately summoned him. "Andrey, can you explain how the data didn't match?" his boss asked. Andrey realized the story was starting to turn against him. He tried to justify himself, blaming the system and his colleagues, but his boss looked at him coldly. "I trusted you," he said, "and that was the worst part." This moment was a turning point. For the first time, Andrey felt that actions he'd considered innocent and well thought out were coming back to haunt him in the form of trouble. He realized that his habit of exploiting others for his own gain was no longer without consequences. That evening, he sat at home, holding a cup of cold coffee, thinking about what Sergei had said. Perhaps this meeting wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps the world really is designed in such a way that every action has its own response, perhaps not immediately, but inevitably. He decided to test himself. He tried to recall all the moments when his actions could have harmed others, and suddenly realized how much had accumulated. Small betrayals, hidden lies, manipulations, all like invisible boomerangs that he was now beginning to receive in return. Andrey lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, he felt an anxiety that couldn't be suppressed by rationalization or sarcasm. He realized that karma isn't a myth, but a reality, and that it inexorably acts, whether a person believes in it or not. From that moment on, his life began to change. Gradually at first, then more dramatically. Small troubles escalated into larger ones, relationships with colleagues became strained, and friends began to notice changes in Andrey's behavior. He understood that if he continued his previous behavior, the consequences would only worsen. It was then, for the first time in many years, that he began to consider what it meant to be honest with himself and others. Understanding this became the first step toward change, a path where he would confront what he had previously ignored, the consequences of his actions, the power of trust, and the shattering of the illusion that one could live without regard for others. Thus began the story of how karma quietly but inexorably begins to play out in the life of a man who had long considered himself smarter than others and free from moral constraints. After that evening on the couch, Andrey realized his familiar way of life was beginning to crumble. He felt his former self-confidence gradually fading, leaving anxiety and irritation in its place. He tried to continue working, but thoughts about the consequences of his own actions were thwarting his concentration. Every phone call, every chat message felt like signals that the world was reacting to his past actions. In the morning, he woke up with a heavy head, not from fatigue, but from internal tension. His phone was already full of messages from colleagues and friends, which had once seemed routine but now felt like quiet accusations. They were writing to him asking for help with tasks, discussing joint projects, but in every text, Andrey sensed a hidden threat, a feeling that people no longer trusted him as much as they once did. At first, he tried to ignore it. "I'm just tired," he told himself. But soon, something he had never expected happened. A new project came up at work, with a very tight deadline. He was promoted to manager. At first glance, this seemed like a great opportunity to prove his abilities once again. But it immediately became clear, no one wanted to work with him directly. His colleagues cautiously agreed to follow his orders, but their eyes betrayed a hint of mistrust. The first days of the project were tense. Andrey began to notice that information that had previously reached him without a problem was now constantly delayed or distorted. Errors that had previously been dismissed as accidental were now piling up. He understood that if he continued to act as he had before, coldly and calculatingly, the consequences would be far more serious than ever. One evening, as he was about to leave, Irina, the same colleague he had once left to deal with a report on her own, approached him. She was calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Andrey, I need to talk to you," she said quietly. He nodded, expecting a standard complaint or request for an explanation. But what she said surprised him. "I know how you run things. But I want to say, people notice. Not just me. And you have to understand, it's coming back." Andrey froze. He wanted to say something, but found no words. This was the first direct warning he'd received from someone observing his actions. He felt something snap inside him, as if an invisible weight he'd long ignored had finally begun to press down. The following weeks became a real test. At work, the situation worsened. A project that should have been a success began to fall apart. His colleagues gradually stopped hiding their dissatisfaction, and some simply distanced themselves. All his attempts to manipulate and control the situation came back like a boomerang. But work wasn't the only arena for his trials. Andrey's personal life also began to echo his actions. He tried dating a girl, but his habit of using people for his own ends resurfaced. The girl, initially captivated by his charisma and confidence, soon noticed his coldness and calculation. The relationship, which had seemed easy and mutually beneficial, began to crumble. Andrey tried to fix the situation through promises and persuasion, but nothing worked. The situation reached a climax one evening when he discovered his car had been scratched in the parking lot. At first, he thought it was an accident, but a neighbor told him he'd seen someone stare at his car for a long time and then walk away openly. This incident became a symbol for Andrey. The world had begun to reciprocate his feelings, just not in the way he expected. One evening, Andrey met with Sergey again. This time, the meeting was more tense. Sergey listened to him talk about problems at work and in his personal life, and then said simply, "You're starting to get what you deserve. Not as punishment, but as a result of who you were. And it may be unpleasant, but it's a chance to understand and change." Andrey realized that this was exactly what he had to do: acknowledge his mistakes and start acting differently. But old habits proved stronger. He tried to manipulate even in his attempts to improve, looking for easy ways out, trying to find workarounds. And each time he suffered another blow, another failure at work, a fight with friends, discontent from his family. One day, he decided to return to his old strategy. Everything is under control. He began analyzing the people around him, trying to anticipate their reactions, calculating every move. But it was then that it became clear that his usual methods no longer worked. People stopped trusting him, his authority at work declined, and his personal life devolved into a series of misunderstandings and conflicts. These events forced Andrey to seriously consider for the first time what karma is in real life. He realized, it doesn't come suddenly or mystically. It manifests itself through the actions of others, through the consequences he himself created. Every wrong decision, every deception, every manipulation came back to him with a precision he couldn't control. Deep down, he began to feel a strange relief. Finally, clarity and understanding emerged. If he continued his old habits, the destruction would continue, but if he changed himself, there would be a chance for restoration. But this was only the beginning of the journey. Change required effort, courage, and honesty, qualities Andrey had long avoided. He began writing down all his mistakes, analyzing every decision, recalling moments when his actions could have harmed others. It was a painful process, full of doubt and irritation, But gradually he began to notice that the more he understood his actions, the easier it became to accept the consequences and seek ways to improve. He soon realized that karma not only returned negative consequences but also pointed to opportunities for growth. For example, one of the colleagues he had once deceived offered to help with a project, as if testing Andrey's willingness to act honestly. Although he initially found it difficult to trust, Andrey realized this opportunity was a chance to change the situation by demonstrating true responsibility. The first changes were small, honest confessions, simple apologies, a refusal to manipulate. But gradually, people began to react differently. Colleagues began to communicate with him again, albeit cautiously. Friends began to show their attention again. And even his relationship with his girlfriend slowly began to improve. For the first time, Andrey experienced a taste of true harmony, based on honesty, not cunning and calculation. This was the first stage of his transformation. He realized that karma is not an abstract force, but a reality manifesting through everyday events. And although the path was difficult, he understood that change was possible. But even greater challenges lay ahead. Because the true test comes when old habits face new challenges, and the past continues to remind itself. Andrey understood, true karma tests not only actions but also intentions. And now he was ready to find out how far he was willing to change in order to live differently. Several months had passed since Andrey began to understand the consequences of his actions. He slowly changed his habits, trying to be honest, showing genuine interest in colleagues and friends, not exploiting people for his own gain. But the world around him continued to test his resolve. At work, the situation remained difficult. Although his colleagues had begun to reconnect with him, their trust was fragile, and every new project became a test. Andrey realized that past mistakes wouldn't simply disappear, their consequences had to be overcome step by step. One day, Irina approached him. She noticed that he had begun to change, but there was a wariness hidden in her gaze. "Andrey," she said quietly, "I think you're trying. But are you ready for the real consequences of your actions?" He froze. He understood these weren't just words. Irina was talking about serious matters. The past left no room for compromise. And indeed, within a week, everything became clear. One evening, a former colleague he'd once deceived for career advancement came to see him at work. The man was calm, almost emotionless, but Andrey saw something he didn't want to see: cold indifference. "Andrey, I need to discuss something," he said. "It concerns an old project." Andrey realized this could be a test, or punishment. He listened attentively. It turned out that the mistakes he'd made earlier had led to major problems for the company, and now the consequences needed to be rectified. This situation became his first major test. Andrey was forced to work with true integrity, accept responsibility for others' mistakes, and acknowledge his own past misdeeds. He realized that karma manifests itself not only through external events but also through the need to face the truth. At the same time, changes were taking place in his personal life. The girl he'd been trying to build a relationship with suddenly left. She couldn't forgive all the petty deceptions and manipulations he'd committed in the past. Andrey experienced deep pain, but unlike before, he didn't look for someone to blame. He realized that these were the consequences of his actions, and that the only way to fix the situation was to work on himself. During these days, he began keeping a journal. He wrote down all his thoughts, analyzed every action, every thought, every conversation. Gradually, he began to understand that karma manifests itself through a chain of events, people, and decisions that are interconnected. It doesn't come suddenly, it builds day by day, through small, seemingly insignificant actions. One of the most difficult tests was a meeting with his former friend, Sergey, who had once tried to guide him toward honesty. This time, Sergei came not just to talk, but to show Andrey the consequences of the mistakes he had made. "You think you can improve," Sergei said, "but will you be willing to do so when everything around you is against you?" Andrey felt a knot in his stomach. He had to make a choice: continue his old habits or truly change, despite the difficulties and losses. He chose change. It wasn't an easy decision. Every day brought new challenges. Colleagues tested his honesty, friends tested his patience, and old grievances resurfaced in the most unexpected forms. But he kept moving forward. During this period, he noticed that the changes were starting to pay off. People began turning to him for help not out of fear or self-interest, but out of trust. He began to understand that karma not only returns the bad but also opens opportunities for growth if you do the right thing. However, one event confronted him with his most difficult choice yet. A new project had emerged at the company that could take him to the next level. But to achieve this, he had to act as he had done before: deceive colleagues, conceal information, and manipulate. Andrey faced a dilemma. He understood that if he continued down the old path, success would be quick, but the consequences would be inevitable. If he chose honesty, the path would be difficult, and he might not achieve his goal. After much deliberation, he decided to follow the honest path. This decision was difficult, but an inner voice told him it was the only right one. He began acting openly, discussing everything with his colleagues, admitting his mistakes, and accepting responsibility. To his surprise, the project gradually began to develop successfully. His colleagues began to trust him. Relationships improved, and even management noticed his honesty and professionalism. Andrey realized that karma manifests itself through opportunities for correction. If you act correctly, the world begins to return positive results. This chapter ended with Andrey experiencing true harmony for the first time. He realized that karma is not a punishment, but a tool for growth. Every action has consequences, and only honesty, responsibility, and sincerity help build a life without destructive consequences. But even greater challenges lay ahead, ones that would test how deeply he had changed. Karma does not forgive minor mistakes, and Andrey had to understand this in order to become truly free from the past. 6 months had passed since Andrey began consciously changing his habits. Each day now began with the thought, "What can I do right today? How will my actions impact others?" These thoughts had become part of his daily life, and he could no longer imagine himself the same person. At work, the changes were noticeable to everyone. Projects that had previously caused conflict were now completed smoothly. His colleagues began to truly trust him. He realized that trust can't be bought or forced. It comes through consistency, honesty, and respect for others. One day, Irina came into the office. She smiled, holding a document in her hands. "Andrey, remember that project we started 6 months ago? We closed it with a profit higher than expected. And that's thanks to your honest work." Andrey felt a slight warmth inside. It was the first time he perceived success not as a personal victory over others, but as the result of a collaborative effort and the right approach. He realized that karma also works positively. When you act honestly, the world responds in kind. But the changes weren't limited to work. Andrey's personal life also changed. The girlfriend he'd broken up with returned to his life. She saw that he had truly changed, that his behavior had become sincere and his intentions open. They began to rebuild a relationship based on trust and respect. It wasn't easy, but now they were learning to be honest with each other and maintain balance. Andrey's family also noticed the changes. He became more attentive to his parents and siblings. He helped without ulterior motives, simply because he understood that help and care are returned, but not always immediately. These small actions gradually strengthened his inner peace. However, the path to harmony wasn't entirely smooth. Old habits sometimes tried to creep back in. The desire to bend the rules, hide the truth, gain benefits without effort. Each time this happened, Andrey stopped and asked himself, how will this affect others? And how will this come back to me? This internal control became a new tool in his life. One of the most important moments was the realization that karma manifests itself not only through external events but also through internal changes. His calm, confidence, and ability to admit his mistakes began to attract people who valued honesty. He understood that a positive cycle of action is created when a person genuinely changes, rather than trying to cheat fate. Over time, Andrey began to help other colleagues recognize their mistakes and develop honesty. He shared his experience, talked about the consequences of his own actions, and demonstrated how small changes can transform lives. His advice began to be trusted, and his example inspired people to act wisely. One evening, Andrey met with Sergey again. This time, the meeting was calm and joyful. "You've traveled a path I didn't expect," said Sergey, "and proven that change is possible. You've realized that karma isn't punishment, but a reflection of your actions." Andrey nodded. He felt gratitude not only for Sergey, but also for the events themselves that had forced him to change. Now he knew, every action has consequences, and only sincerity, responsibility, and honesty make life harmonious. A few more months passed, and Andrey noticed that his life was truly changing. The troubles that had previously haunted him gradually disappeared. He no longer worried about trivial things and began to appreciate the people around him. His successes no longer felt like a personal victory over others, but the result of shared effort and honest work. It became especially important for him to understand that karma is constantly at work, even in the smallest things. Every action, word, and thought creates future reality. He realized that you can't change the past, but you can control the present and build the future. In the final days of his story, Andrey sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sunset. He remembered the person he had once been: cold, calculating, seeking profit at any cost. He smiled, not ironically, but with understanding. "Now I understand," he said to himself, "that life isn't about winning and losing, but about the choices we make every day. And karma is a mirror that reveals who you truly are." At that moment, he felt inner harmony. He knew there would still be difficulties, mistakes, and trials ahead. But now he was ready to face them honestly, mindfully, and with respect for himself and others. Thus ended the first stage of his journey, a journey that showed him that karma is real and that it manifests itself through everyday actions, through honesty and responsibility. Andrey understood that life can only be harmonious and happy when you accept the consequences of your actions and learn to act wisely. He no longer feared the future because he now understood that every new day was a chance to act in a way that would make the world return good to you. And this understanding became his true achievement.